This morning I want to share with you another of William Bosch's stories from a world of stories. This one is about a young med student. And this young med student was headed from Ithaca, New York to New Haven, Connecticut to take his medical comps. He was going to be gone for about a month of test taking. And he was very heavy of heart. He was very sad. He was very down. He was very depressed because, you see, he had just gotten engaged. And he was leaving his fiancée for the first time. And it nearly broke his heart. Her tears, his tears, and all the sadness, and he couldn't concentrate on his exams. He just wanted to turn around and go back to New York and spend the time with his fiancée. He was so heavy of heart. The pain and the anguish was just more than he could bear. Well, he was on a bus, an old bus that traveled back and forth between the two cities. And they stopped at a rest stop. He got off the bus and went into the dingy old bus station. And there he sat down at a dirty table, a U-shaped table, on a dirty chair. And he waited. And the sadness that was in his heart must have been reflected on his face. Because pretty soon the old woman who was across the table from him looked at him and said, "Are you okay?" And all the young med student could get out was no, before the tears started to come and he just started crying. The old lady, in her love and in her compassion, reached across the table and was going to pat him on the cheek and tell him it was okay. But when he saw the dirty hand and the dirt under her fingernails, he recoiled. And so she just simply asked, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" Well, with that, with tears running down his face, he reached into his back pocket, took out his wallet, and he found a picture of his girlfriend, of his fiancée, and he handed it to her. And the old woman was, "Oh, such a beautiful creature, what a most gorgeous girl I've ever seen." And that was all the young med student needed to start sharing his story about how this was his fiancée and that he had just left her back home and he wanted to turn around in all the pain. And the old lady just sat there and listened. She listened to the whole story. She let him pour out his grief and his pain and his anguish. And she listened. When he had finished, she gave him back the picture. And then she told him a little bit about her story. About how she had been married to a wonderful man. They'd had a wonderful marriage. But he was a traveling salesman. And every so often, he just had to go out, and he had to travel, and he had to try to sell his wares. And every time he left, the pain and the anguish that was in her heart, she thought her heart would break. The tears would come, and it just thought, when would it end? But then something amazing happened. Each time he would come home. And when they were reunited, the love and the passion and the joy would fill her heart, and she would be so happy and so excited, and the two of them would embrace, and it was just a wonderful thing. Marriage was a wonderful thing. Being married and loving one another was just a beautiful thing in one's life. And you're going to have a wonderful marriage. You're going to have a wonderful time together. Don't worry. Trust me. You'll be just fine. And when the old lady had finished her little story, she said, maybe you'll feel better if you eat something. So she got herself up and she ambled over to the counter where she purchased a donut. A donut. She brought her prize back. She took it back to the table where she and the med student had been sitting. She took the donut, she broke it, she gave some to him, and he ate it. About that time, there was an announcement on the intercom, and the old lady said, "Oh my goodness, that's my bus." And she disappeared. She was gone. It wasn't until that moment, it wasn't until that very instant that the med student realized who had been present in that conversation, who had been present at that dirty table. It was the same person who had been present all those years ago, some 2,000 years before, on that road to Emmaus. When two of Jesus' disciples, not two of the original 12, and not those big name ones, but the two other followers of Jesus, they were on that road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, about a 7-mile journey. It took a lot longer back then. They couldn't just get in their cars and drive. They had to walk. And as they're walking along, this is Easter Sunday, and they're confused. They don't know what's going on. They're talking about all the events that have happened, and they look rather sad, and pretty soon they realize that they've been joined by a third person. The Bible tells us, Scripture tells us, that it's Jesus. But these disciples, these two disciples, they don't recognize him. They don't see that it's Jesus, at least not right away. And Jesus asks, "What are you talking about?" Yeah, that's a way to strike up conversation. And the two disciples stop and they look down. They look. "You're a visitor to Jerusalem. You've been here and you don't know what's going on. You don't know about all the things that have happened in the last few days." And Jesus looks at them and says, "What things?" What things? And so the two disciples start telling Jesus all about Jesus. They start telling him about all the great and wonderful things that Jesus had done during his life, during his time of teaching. How so many people thought that he was a prophet, perhaps even the Messiah, that he was the one to come. But then the leaders of the people, the scribes, the Pharisees, the leaders became jealous. They turned him over to the Romans, and the Romans had crucified him 3 days before. But this was Sunday. And something really strange had happened. That morning, some women, some followers of Jesus, had gone to the tomb, and they found that the stone had been rolled away, that the tomb was empty. And then they claimed to have seen angels. Well, some men among the group also then went to the tomb to check it out, and they found it just as the women had said. But they didn't see his body. So we don't know what's going on. We are confused. And Jesus looks at them and says, "Oh, you foolish people. How is it you don't understand the Scripture? After all these years, after all these centuries, you don't understand the Scriptures and what was written of the Christ and what must happen to him. Let me explain it to you." And so for the rest of the journey, Jesus is opening up the Scripture to them. You can imagine it's passage after passage where Jesus is explaining from Moses through Malachi all the things that had to happen to Jesus, all the things that had to happen to the Christ that had happened. And before they knew it, their little band had traveled the 7 miles. They were in Emmaus. They had made it to their village. And Jesus acts as if he's going to go on further, but the two disciples say, No. It's getting late. You need to stay with us. Come stay with us. Come eat with us. We've enjoyed your company. Come join us. So Jesus does. They find a place to stay. They go in. They find a place to eat. They sit down together. The food is brought. Jesus picks up the bread, blesses it, breaks it, gives it to his disciples, and their eyes are opened. It's at that very instant their eyes are, they see, it's Jesus. He's there with them. He's alive. And then he disappears. And he's gone. Well, the disciples, they're ecstatic. They're excited. Jesus was here. On the road, didn't you feel it when Jesus was talking to us and explaining the scripture to us from Moses through the prophets? Didn't you feel your heart warmed? And yes, we need to go back. And we need to go back to Jerusalem and tell the rest of the disciples what we've seen. So even though it was late, they got themselves up and they walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. And they heard how others had seen Jesus. Simon Peter had seen him. And then they told the disciples how they too had seen Jesus on the road to Emmaus. There are many roads in life. Right now, we're not supposed to be taking very many of them. Traveling from the grocery store to home to the grocery store, back and forth, that's basically what we've been told to limit ourselves to for everyone's public safety. Gone are the constant trips to work, to the office, to the school. Kids aren't going to school. We're basically told to stay home and keep ourselves on a single road. And even though our roads right now have been somewhat limited, we're still on a path. It's just a different path from the one that we're used to. But we're still on the path. We're still on the road. And where will it take us? Where will it take us? Earlier I mentioned the domestic violence and child abuse are on the rise. But I've also been hearing other stories. I've been hearing stories about people who say, at first we thought this was going to be absolutely terrible. Stay home, don't go anywhere, can't do anything. We thought this was going to be absolutely awful, but you know what we're finding? What we're finding is we actually have time for each other. We're actually finding time to sit down and eat a meal together. Mom and Dad don't have to worry about getting dressed and doing their hair and getting everything ready to go so that they can rush off to their meetings or to their work or to their other obligations. Moms and dads aren't worrying about having to rush off and take kids to this practice or that ball game or this ball game. No, we're staying home. We're staying home. And so we're eating together. We're eating meals. We're breaking bread together as families. A tradition that had kind of gone by the wayside. Other people are telling me, we found the old Monopoly game. That old Monopoly game that had been hidden back there on the shelf somewhere, we took it out, blew the dust off, and the kids asked us, "What's that?" They had never seen the Monopoly game before, and so the families are sitting down and they're playing Monopoly together. They haven't done in years. Others are telling me that the parents are sitting down with their children and playing video games together, and the parents are saying, "What's that?" Believe me, kids, we had video games back then too. My kids don't believe it, but we did have video. They just looked a little different back then, but we did have video games. Your games are a lot more complicated than ours were. But we did have games. We had video games, and we had board games. And families are sitting down together because they've slowed down. They've slowed down. And that they've found again those rituals of family life that in some instances we've sort of lost. But what we're also finding is when we slow down, and sometimes in the very ritual themselves, that there's someone else present. Just as that med student found in his conversation with the old lady. Just as the disciples found on their road and on their path to Emmaus. When they finally stopped and got off the road and sat down and broke bread, their eyes were opened. They saw Jesus was there. And that's my hope and prayer for us as well. As we get off all the busy roads of life and we slow down. And God pulls us to this one path. That through our rituals of gameplay, breaking bread together, that we will see Christ is with us too. That the Jesus Christ of love and compassion is right there with us, if we will just open our eyes and see that Jesus is there doing what Jesus has always done. Teaching us how to love and care for one another. That our God is right there with us. Our God is right there with us doing what God has always done. Bringing order out of chaos. Creating good. Bringing light and life out of darkness. God is there. Christ is there. And as we slow down, as we break bread together, as we share these rituals of game playing, Christ brings us together. And we can say with the disciples of old, He's alive. I'm seeing. He's alive.